Our first reading is Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17, and I'll be reading the New International Version. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth, and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on the earth. Our second reading is 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 12 through 13. Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Each week, it seems like things in the world are going a little further off the rails. As I was writing this sermon earlier this week, there was a bomb threat at the Library of Congress and at Times Square, and a truck was on fire in the middle of San Francisco's Bay Bridge. Winchester was and is back under a mandatory mask mandate for indoor spaces. Tropical Storm Fred had just dumped a pile of rain, and we were at the moment under a tornado warning. And Hurricane Henri is rolling into New England today. With multiple disasters in Haiti, the turmoil and fear in Afghanistan, and there being not a single ICU bed left in the entire state of Alabama due to COVID, it is a lot to process. But we are not the first to live in cataclysmic times. And the people of God, since the days of Noah, have preserved a concept that I think can provide an anchor for distressing times, both great and small. That concept is called covenant, and we'll celebrate a form of it shortly in the specifically Christian covenant of baptism. But to really understand what a covenant is, we have to go back to the very earliest human societies, to the days when there were stories of great floods that swept away everything, and those who survived wondered how to possibly move on from there. Anthropologists tell us that the earliest humans were organized in family units, and the rules of society were based on kinship. Nothing more was needed when the Earth's population was so small. We see that throughout the stories of Genesis. From Adam and Eve on through Abraham and his descendants, everyone's safety, security, care, and provision came from their own flesh and blood. Or as the idiom was in ancient Near East society, bone and flesh. When we say flesh and blood, they said bone and flesh. When Adam looks at Eve in Genesis 2:23 and says, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," he's using kinship language. He's recognizing Eve as family. And that's how societies were structured for thousands of years. Even as late as the stories of Abraham, which scholars say are set somewhere around 2000 BCE, family members mostly married each other. Abraham married his niece, Sarah. His grandson Jacob marries two of his cousins, as well as several of their servants. But as the earth population grew, kinship became more difficult to manage, as anyone with in-laws can tell you. As populations started to move around and inevitably began to marry outside of even the very extended family, they had a problem. Is this new spouse from a different bloodline to be considered family? When family is the only structure for protection and care, being able to identify who is and isn't family is really a life and death matter. So the answer to that problem was to give a marriage additional meaning. It became more than just a union, but a covenant. With this added element, the couple would take vows of protection and support and present a physical sign in the presence of witnesses so that all would know that the family obligations and circle of care in that family were now to be extended to this new person. Every covenant is some version of that, a way to extend the privileges and the responsibilities of a particular family to someone currently outside of it. Expanding the family is a serious matter. You're entrusting the new family members with your own life and safety, and you'll have to pony up to care for them too. So covenant comes always with a standard set of vows, visible signs that are widely recognized, and the whole thing is witnessed and affirmed by a community. Now, covenants are different from contracts. Contracts are agreement that might include some of the provisions that exist in covenants, but without the understanding that there's any special kind of bond being created. If someone breaks a contract, there might be anger, lawsuits, or even a war. But the breaking of a contract doesn't affect our basic sense of identity because establishing a contract hasn't made you a family. Churches are based in covenant, which is why church conflicts hit people so much harder than conflicts at the office. You have a contract with your employer. You have a covenant relation when you join the church. Now, Christians didn't invent religious covenants. We inherited them from our faith parent, Judaism. What the particular faith of the ancient Israelites brought to the world's religious table, and that was passed directly into the DNA of Christianity, was an understanding of a God who desired to be in covenant relation with humanity to make us family. That was radically different than the religions of the surrounding peoples of the time. Israel's God didn't look for groveling worshipers like the gods of Babylon or Egypt, but instead wanted to expand the divine family to include everything that God has made. And that radical idea wasn't a late development for Judaism. That kind of covenant is exactly what we get at the end of the Noah story in Genesis 9. The setting for that somewhere around 6000 BCE. And it's one of the things that makes the Bible's flood story different than, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh or the other flood myths of the time. After the flood in Genesis, God takes a vow to never again destroy the earth with water. So listen up, Henri. That promise is witnessed by Noah and his family, and God provides a sign to go with it, the bow in the clouds. God establishes a covenant with Noah and all of his descendants. And since Noah and his family are the only ones left on the earth at this point in the story, the implication is that God's family extends to all humans. But it's not just humans. That first ever religious covenant in Israel is between God and every living creature of the earth. It established kinship, an intimate family bond, and an obligation of mutual care, that went both ways between God, humans, and every single thing that lives and breathes. In the Genesis version of the flood story, God and all earthly life are joined in a family of mutual love and care, of privilege and obligation. In the theology of Genesis, God makes promises to the world, and not just the other way around. The covenant between God and all living things in Genesis 9 stretches across time and space like the rainbow that signifies it. As other covenants are established in the Bible, they exist beneath that bow in the clouds that continues to declare all of us kindred. Underneath that rainbow sits the covenant God made specifically with Abraham and his descendants, a covenant with a sign that was cut into the flesh of all males. Later came a behavioral covenant, offered first by Moses to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, but available still to all who vow to live by the Ten Commandments. As we talked about 2 weeks ago, the sign of that covenant is the keeping of the Sabbath. Christians also have a covenant that's particular to us, while still remaining within the family of the earth, signified by the rainbow. That covenant for us is baptism, when the church extends our offer of family privilege and responsibility to all who are willing to live by its vows. Baptism, whether it happens at birth or later in life, marks the beginning of the Christian journey. When we baptize a young child, like, say, Elizabeth Ruth, it's technically the parents and the godparents or other sponsors who are taking the covenant vows, with the child having a chance to confirm that covenant for themselves later when they're older. Now, we also recognize baptism with another kind of churchy word called sacrament, which is our way of saying we believe that God actually shows up in the moment of baptism, a means for even the youngest infant to experience God's grace. Baptism as a sacrament proclaims that you don't have to pass some kind of test to earn God's love. You don't have to be able to understand anything at all for God to show up and bless us. In this act, we profess that God is here to help mark the beginning of a child's faith journey and God's availability to help both parents and child when the going gets rough, as it will. Baptism as sacrament is about the person being baptized. Baptism as covenant is also about the baptized when that person is old enough to take the vows for themselves. But before that, the covenant of baptism recognizes the parents and godparents or other sponsors as being the guide for the first leg of the child's faith journey until they're old enough to understand and confirm the covenant for themselves. But either way, those who are being baptized become part of the extended Christian family, either on their own or through the agency of their parents or sponsors. And during the ceremony, the congregation of a local church stands in for Christians everywhere to affirm, to witness, and welcome our new covenant members. We also witness a baptism to remember and recommit to the vows that we ourselves have taken to become part of this community. In doing so, the entire body is strengthened, which is why we don't do private baptisms. It's about all of us together. The church is the family of the baptized. That doesn't remove us from the first covenant between God and all living things. And it doesn't make us better than those who have other covenant relationships that are particular to them. What baptism marks is the beginning of a specifically Christian journey, and we who are on that road pledge our care and support to the baptized, both children and adults, as part of our particular family within the larger covenant of God's rainbow love for the world. As an example of what that means in practice, I want to share a story from the church that I served in Dover, New Hampshire. To date, I have never been prouder of a congregation I've served than I was of them in the moment their vows to become the family of the baptized took concrete form. One Sunday, a member of the congregation stood up during those joys and concerns time to ask for prayers for Sarah, his teenage daughter. Sarah had struggled with anorexia for quite some time. She'd been in and out of hospitals and treatment centers and therapies. Nothing had worked. As he choked back tears, he said that she was now literally starving to death, to the point where they were daily checking her vital signs. The only thing they hadn't tried was a treatment center in Arizona that used equine therapy. It had a reputation as the Cadillac of care for eating disorders. But they weren't a Cadillac family. And even if they put their house on the market the next day to pay for it, Sarah simply didn't have that much time. He wasn't asking for money, just for prayers, as he and his wife helplessly watched their firstborn child slip away. I spoke to him after the service to see what that treatment would cost. $25,000. That number resonated with me. It was early in the calendar year, and after several years of deficit budgets, the church had managed to right the ship and had climbed up to a budget surplus at the end of the prior year. That surplus was $25,000. But it was not a surplus at the moment. It had been allocated to the current year's budget. Church council convened Sunday afternoon. Sarah didn't have time for a fundraising drive. Could we just give him the money? There were objections, and we had fairly heated discussion. That wasn't extra money, some said. What sort of precedent were we setting? We can do this for every child? She's been through treatment many times already. What if this doesn't work either? But Sarah was not just a child of that father and mother. By virtue of her baptism, Sarah was our child. When we welcomed that family into our church, they became our family. Their child wasn't dying. Our child was dying. By Tuesday morning, we were able to give the family a check for $25,000, and members had donated enough of their airline miles that we could fly the whole family from New Hampshire to Arizona. They arrived at the ranch by midweek. Perhaps the horses there recognized that by virtue of God's rainbow covenant with all living things, Sarah was part of their herd too. But whatever it was, it worked. 10 years ago, this past June, I choked back tears, as I still do, as I joined Sarah and her husband in the covenant of marriage. Last month, their second child was born, happy and healthy, every one of them. I've shared this story with her permission, so if you're watching, Sarah, hey. And the cherry on top, at the end of that calendar year, after pulling out $25,000 from the budget and creating a significant deficit yet again, the church, again, ended with a surplus. That's what covenant means, to extend the privileges and responsibilities of family by taking vows that are witnessed by others and signified in a material way. All covenants have visible signs, and the sign of the baptismal covenant is water. Apparently, God is so pleased to have the Shappas join the family that an entire hurricane's worth of water is showing up for the occasion. As we baptize Elizabeth Ruth Shappa today, and receive her parents, Andrew and Ginny, into membership at Crawford United Methodist Church. We will signify that particular Christian covenant with water from the font. But do watch the sky over the next day or two. When Henri passes, somewhere there's going to be a rainbow. Amen.